Well, I'd like to welcome you all to MIT if you're not from MIT, and welcome to 32123 if you are. I want to particularly welcome you to the 17th Henry Kendall Lecture. It's to be presented today by Professor Gretchen C. So I'm Ron Prynne. I direct MIT Center for Global Change Science that co-sponsors this lecture series together with the Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences, in which I'm a faculty member. So the Henry Kendall Memorial Lecture Series honors the memory of Professor Henry Kendall. He was a Nobel laureate in physics in 1990 and a very long-time distinguished member of MIT's physics faculty. And as most of you know in this audience, he was an ardent environmentalist. The Kendall Lecture allows MIT faculty and students and the public to be introduced to forefront areas in global change science by outstanding researchers, and we've had a wonderful group in the past, and we're looking forward very much to Gretchen's talk here. Henry was a founding member and past chair of the Union of Concerned Scientists. He played a leading role in organizing a number of very influential scientific community statements on global problems, including the World Scientist Warning to Humanity in 1992 and the call for action at the Kyoto Climate Summit in 1997. So these are quoted in the little booklet that you can pick up. I hope you're able to pick up as you walk in. If not, there'll be more copies out there to take when you leave. Coincidentally, this particular lecture marks the 50th anniversary of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Dr. Peter Frumhoff is somewhere in the audience here, or should be. Yes, there. And so congratulations to the UCS for this milestone in the history of that organization. So today's lecturer, Gretchen C. She is the Bing Professor of Environmental Science in the Department of Biology at Stanford University. She's the director of the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford and a senior fellow at Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. Her overall interests include biogeography, conservation biology, and ecology. Gretchen C.'s scientific research addresses what is now known as countryside biogeography and also the future dynamics of biodiversity change. Countryside biogeography is a new conceptual framework for elucidating the fates of population, species, and ecosystems in a growing fraction of the Earth's non-urban land surface, whose ecosystem qualities are more and more strongly influenced by humanity. And the issue is, where does all of this go? Using findings from research done in countryside biogeography, Gretchen and colleagues are attempting to determine what species are most important and most merit protection, and what is the scientific basis for deciding the relative importance of species within a given ecosystem. She's attempting to link projected changes in biodiversity and ecosystems to changes in services to humanity, such as production of goods, life support processes, and genetic diversity for future use. In other words, to put a price on the environment that we should keep very much in mind. It isn't just there to look at. We now use it more and more. As one of the co-founders of the Natural Capital Project, she's working with private landowners, economists, lawyers, business people, and government agencies to incorporate environmental issues into business practice and public policy. Gretchen received her bachelor's in 1986, master's in 1987, PhD in 1992, all in biological sciences, all at Stanford University. Very easy to introduce degrees. Gretchen Daly has received many awards and honors during her academic career, and I'm going to read them because it's an impressive list, and not all of them. The 21st Century Scientist Award in 2000, the Sophie Prize in 2008, the International Cosmos Prize in 2009, the 16th Annual Heinz Award with a special focus on global change, the Midori Prize in 2010, Volvo Environment Prize in 2012, Blue Planet Prize in 2017. These are all of the things that, in environmental science that are coveted prizes, to be sure. She also received the 2018 BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award. Gretchen is a board member at the Beja Institute for Ecological Economics and at the Nature Conservancy, a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Philosophical Society. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to welcome you, Gretchen, to MIT today. The title of Gretchen's talk, as you can see, is Valuing Nature and Real-World Decisions.
Thank you for that really kind introduction, and mainly for the invitation out here. There's so much fabulous work going on, and I've had a just fantastic day meeting with students and faculty here, and I know it's a big room, and we won't have sort of intimate conversation here, but feel free to interrupt at any time and raise questions or comments as we go along. What I'd like to do, I guess, first off, let me see if I can open this. Oops. Yeah, just start off reflecting on some occasions when I felt so lucky to get to know Henry Kendall myself. I was a postdoc working at this wonderful lab. How many of you know the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab up in Colorado at Gothic? Near Crested Butte at about 10,000 feet. So that was a good spot from Henry's point of view. And he'd come out in the summers. There were a lot of interesting people there, including John Holdren, who's been Obama's science advisor and is at Harvard now, and Tim Wirth, a senator from Colorado, who got a lot of environmental legislation passed back in the day and then ran the UN Foundation, and a whole slew of scientists really passionate about research and about the fate of the world, our subjects today. And I remember Henry, we'd get to sit around. He stayed with me and these other grad students in our lowly cabin, and we had a lot of fun chatting into the evenings. And I remember he used to say something that I didn't quite get at the time, but I could tell I needed to get it, that summers are becoming more and more like long weekends for me. And I'm getting it now as I get older myself. And he also said a lot, about this quoted on the UCS website and elsewhere. We must act swiftly in order to halt the decay our planet faces. And that was kind of at the forefront of a lot of the conversation. And it's sure more and more at the forefront of all our thinking, I'm sure, to have you come here. And so I'm going to start off on a tough note, as to all that we face, but then what I want to do is get into some really promising looking pathways. I mean, ever holding on to hope that we can drive the change that we need to open, a better future, to secure, people and nature. So living in California, it's just unreal. I can't tell you, even being relatively far from most of these fires, it's unreal living there and having this kind of a tragedy unfold. And I know it's the case all across in different forms. North America, here, Houston, and then obviously across the world. We all work very internationally. I work a lot in China now, and it's just staggering to see the extremes that are opening up in human experience. and to ask ourselves, well, what can we do, at this point? What should we try to do, and what are the most maybe strategic pathways for making an impact? So that's what I'd like to get into. And I've taken a point of entry, relating to valuing nature. And you'll see what I mean by that. It's partly sort of putting a price tag on. So rather than an all-you-can-eat buffet, we have a sense of scarcity and that we need some table manners, and we need to be investing in, I'm just seeing some good friends here, investing in our life support systems, as opposed to looking at them as, sort of one-time exhaustible sort of set of resources. And I'm going to start with Costa Rica, one of my favorite countries where I've been lucky to work since 1991. Here's a shot of me back then as a grad student. And the question of the day was, could biodiversity exist outside of native habitat, especially tropical biodiversity that had evolved in moist, darker tropical forests? Could it really survive and thrive out in the much drier, open, exposed to sunlight agricultural areas? So I bring this up because it meant going around to a lot of different farms and asking to work on those farms to see whether, given that agriculture and our food production activities are in many ways the biggest driver of biodiversity loss up to now, whether we could confront that by integrating nature more cleverly into agricultural practices. So working on a lot of people's lands, they all said, sure, come on, let me show you everything I got. And they'd give me their kids to help monitor and guard our little traps, in this case for butterflies, putting little numbers on the butterflies to see how they traveled around the landscape, using this kind of delicious rotting banana bait that was spiked with molasses and rum. Would bring these butterflies in from all over. And the thing I kept coming up against, though, as a grad student back then, was how, just to mention one angle, these kids all ate the butterfly bait, and it was sweet at one level. At another level, the bait turned bad after a few hours, and it's that the kids didn't have enough to eat. And, I kept feeling very uncomfortable pursuing these studies and wondering, well, how could we really harmonize the need to grow more food and to have livelihoods, whether it's in food production or coffee or other things, with conservation. And about that time, this amazing scientist, Alvaro Manya, you might have heard of him, he shared in the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a hydrologist and an economist, got his degrees at Stanford. So I happened to get to know him, and then he set up the first Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, and he set up the first national payment for ecosystem services scheme, where you're basically saying, okay, ecosystems are a capital asset, just like, other types of capital, physical capital, like here we have in our universities or homes, human capital as we cultivate here our knowledge and skills as well as our health. Other types of capital we can think about that ecosystems also provide a stream of benefits. And he set up a program that's been, by all accounts, it's been subject to a lot of scrutiny and things, but over all these years, it's been operating for over 20 years now, that paid people for this particular set of services. And he got European countries to buy in to the first carbon offsets for climate stability. He got the national hydropower company, the electricity company basically. Most of Costa Rica's electricity is generated through hydropower, to pay in for the role of forests in regulating water flow and maintaining the lifetime of hydropower facilities, holding back sediment and stuff like that. Biodiversity benefits, he got Merck Pharmaceuticals to pay in. It was just sort of a nominal amount, but raised awareness of the fact that the majority of our modern day pharmaceuticals, something like 120 of the top 150, trace their origin to plants, mostly tropical plants. And then scenic beauty, with all there is, the often the biggest sector in Costa Rica is tourism. So these payments might look like very little, but this amount would be a lot actually in the United States, even to shift practices on land. And they are credited together with other policy changes. It's always hard to disentangle the exact impact of any particular change in a rapidly changing and complex world, but credited with having helped turn around a situation where Costa Rica had the highest deforestation rate in the world ever recorded to now having, net reforestation. So with that sort of story in mind, what I'd like to do is go through an arc of thinking about what understanding we need that we can generate in universities through research, and then what connection we need with people out on the land and in policy arenas and financial investment arenas and such to bring about that kind of a transformation where we're driving economic dimensions of growth that are important, but at the same time dramatically reducing our impact on the life support systems we depend on utterly. So securing human well-being at the same time as securing the environment over the long run. So all this has led to Costa Rica remaining a pioneer. We're continuing to work there. The new president, I don't know how many of you know of him, I think he's the youngest on earth. He got elected at the age of 38, and now he's a ripe old 39. And he's supporting a lot of investment in decarbonizing the economy by 2050 is the goal, in a race to be the first or among the first nations to do so, and in designing many other types of investments in nature and restoring even much more forest, for example, than they have so far. So to tell the story, I'm going to back off a little bit and give a bit of the history, going back to yet another Nobel laureate, Ken Arrow, who was based at Stanford University, passed away just a couple years ago, but played a founding role and a really vital role in legitimizing and developing a new field kind of at the interface of environment, or certainly ecology and economics, and kind of incorporating many other disciplines into the effort as time went on. And just showing how nature can be seen as a type of asset, and justifying investments in nature even within our current economic system. Shortly after that arena started opening up, there were many pioneering cases actually coming along, the one in Costa Rica being just one example. Another with which you're probably all familiar here in New York was a decision when water quality started dipping below minimum EPA standards to invest not in a water filtration plant like they had, for the Croton watershed, where about 10% of the water supply for New York originates, but instead to invest up in the Catskills, Delaware, watershed where 90% of the water originates at a much lower cost. So that was sort of their choice, investing in physical capital or in natural capital to achieve water security for the 9 or 10 million people drinking water in New York City. And it was estimated, to be a lot less expensive at $1 to $1.5 billion going into the watershed and changing the way people like David Hawley, the guy standing on the left, is managing his dairy farm using that solar heated tent in place of the beautiful but otherwise not very healthy New England barns, the traditional barns, but dank and dark inside, where cattle are often getting, or dairy cows often getting different types of illness that get passed right on to people. So with that stark difference, investing in the operations of farmers and foresters and sort of towns up in the Catskills versus paying $6 to $8 billion to build a filtration plant. The decision was clear. It wasn't without a battle that I'm sure you know about, but it was a pretty stark choice back then, and the decision has been maintained New York City is still reliant on filtering its water naturally through the roots and soils of the Catskills mountain range rather than through any built filtration system. So in a way, it's a triple win, right? The people in the city so far are getting clean drinking water at the lowest possible cost. People up in the source area are getting paid for benefits that they've supplied throughout the history of the city but never really been recognized for. And then if you care about anything else, would you rather have a romantic weekend away at a filtration plant or up in the beautiful Catskills? You can think of the many other benefits that were not really quantified in this analysis and yet that are being supported by the decision. So how do we extend that? How do we systematize and build a universal approach to take these cases and replicate them all over the world? Supposedly about, a kind of back of the envelope analysis shows that at least a quarter of the world's major cities would have an economic justification in investing in upper watersheds to secure water supply rather than building filtration plants. What's limiting us in replicating and scaling that New York City model? How do we extend Costa Rica's model across other countries and drive open this pathway to green growth or green development that would have multiple wins? That's the big challenge before us. So about this time, a large group formed the Natural Capital Project. It's basically a partnership into which everyone is welcome. There are about 50 research institutions, about 200 plus implementing institutions around the world. And the idea is to build up these approaches, demonstrate them, and scale them. So just a tiny bit of background to dive into a few stories on both the research and on how it's going in terms of scaling and real impact. So, what is natural capital? We're just talking about Earth's lands, waters, and variety of life, or biodiversity, which you would have read about in the papers today, is being driven to extinction at an all-time record rate. And then, so what is the value of natural capital? That's a tough question. And we've often thought about the, not wanting to be offensive or worse, just completely lacking in meaning and trying to slap a price tag on nature when we know that at one level it's sort of infinitely valuable. We're all part of nature. If we think about our lives and how brief they are on this planet and what we're all connected to, we could get into realms that are kind of being left behind in the way cultures are evolving today, and yet are really important for thinking about what matters, and that thought that nature is infinitely valuable and we shouldn't be, from a moral perspective, just driving everything to extinction as the dominant species on the planet. Yet in decisions, mostly nature comes in at a zero if it's not something to be extracted or mined, and in which case it's not living anyway. So neither of those extremes has helped, inform decisions in a productive way. And the idea here is to develop lower bound values that are meaningful and change decisions. So obviously we can think about being on a sterile planet or like the moon and recognize that in fact we're totally dependent, always have been and always will be, on the different life support processes of the biosphere, that thin layer of life about Earth, for our atmosphere, for soils and all their fertility, for a hydrologic cycle, for basically everything that underpins our food security, water security, climate and energy security, health, and so on. But how do we reconcile with the rapid rate of depletion that Henry was so concerned with? And how do we operate, given that now, humanity is a global force more than ever before, demanding more and more of nature, making it more and more scarce. How do we capture the value in our decisions before it's too late? So there wasn't much on this in the early days. What we've developed as a community over the past 20 years, basically, is an approach that is oriented around informing decisions, like I said, and looking at how alternative decisions, our different choices, building a filtration plant or investing in the upper watershed to restore the functioning of nature, how they affect ecosystems, how that it would affect the delivery of services or benefits to people, improving well-being, and then how we can transmit that understanding through our institutions to change decisions. That's kind of the framing. And I'll just dive into some stories more on the right there, asking a couple of basic questions, and then showing how we can take this understanding and really drive change in policy, in finance, and in management. So heading over here, I'm going to first dive into this question of, what good is biodiversity? Basically, if you're a farmer, we're all consumers of what farmers produce, so we ought to care as well. But if you're out in the countryside, how do you harmonize? How do you make it so those girls eating the bait for the butterfly traps can live a decent life and sustain or restore tropical forest? And how much hope is there even for sustaining biodiversity in deforested parts of the countryside? What we've found over about 30 years now of many doctoral dissertations and many different approaches to the research is that a lot can be sustained, not everything, but a significant amount. Well, I'll show you more specifically in a second, of native tropical biodiversity in farming habitats if we conduct our farming in a wildlife-friendly way, like this royal flycatcher getting pretty upset at being caught in a net, but he's about to be let go. There's his mate, even more upset at the whole thing. Here's a bat, the biggest bat, spectrals bat found in the Americas, and it's the largest carnivorous bat, goes around eating those birds. And here we are in a coffee plantation. That's a coffee shrub over the shoulder of Jason there. So all kinds of stuff, the silky anteater. If you go around and do any level of looking, this is a really bright, hopeful finding. And over the many years of these different dissertations, what I'm going to show here is just one little summary set of statistics. The fraction found in forest only, it's high for plants. You see most plants are found in forest only in the dark green part of the bar. But with just about everything else, if you have enough forest in a landscape, it seems that at least over the decadal time scale, it's hard to say over the long run, you can sustain surprisingly high levels, abundances and diversities of these different groups of organisms. So that's the proportion of native species to Costa Rica and all those different groups. So that's really hopeful. But so let's say you're a farmer, and that means you do have a potential role to play, but why would you, adjust your farming in order to sustain biodiversity? What benefits might there be for you? Are there any at all, or would you just be providing a public service for society? And here's one way into the problem. It's just to think about, well, what do all these organisms do? And what do we depend on? One case is pollination. A huge fraction of our crops, about a third of our food supply comes from pollinated species or types of crops. And it's the most nutritious stuff. It's the fruits, vegetables, nuts, and things like that. And that shows you, this is part of the country where a lot of coffee is grown. I think we're all probably even more dependent on coffee these days at MIT and Stanford than fruits, nuts, and veggies. But anyway, it's pollinated. But actually, guess how many, weeks of the year coffee is blooming? And think about it from the point of view of a bee pollinator that needs nectar and pollen every day. Can a pollinator survive in a coffee plantation? There's basically no way. Does anybody want to guess how many days of the year coffee is blooming, providing nectar and pollen? It's something like 5 days a year. And it's a spectacular 5 days. It looks like the whole landscape has erupted in sort of popcorn. But in that brief time, bees come out from nearby forest where you've got a huge variety of plants that are blooming in all the different weeks of the year and supporting what bees need. So we can ask that question, does the nearby forest benefit coffee farmers? And can we measure those benefits? So I'm going to show you just really briefly how this sort of work is done. Across a landscape, you try to find places that, in this case, are near and far from forest, where coffee is being grown and where you're controlling for the many other factors that could vary across a distance gradient like that. And you want to isolate the effect of distance from forest on the bee community and the activities of the bees. And what we found is the closer you are, say, to forest, the more diverse were the bees, the more pollination you had. So you're there counting the little tiny pollen grains that are transferred between flowers. And you actually got 20% higher yields and 50% higher quality. And this is in coffee, a plant that's now self-pollinating, but there's still a huge benefit to cross-fertilization. So for this one farm, that amounted to a little over $60,000 per year additional income, and that's massive. All the difference between being bankrupt and being solvent and profitable as a farmer. So you could ask this same question about other types of services. In the case of the bees, here's another question for you just to have your mind going. Guess how many types of bee are out there performing pollination in coffee? Is it 10 or 20 or anybody want to throw out a number? 30. It's a staggering, what were you going to guess? 3. Okay, it was about 700. I mean, so I'm just brushing past things here, but we nearly went blind and crippled, hunched over microscopes with the glorious day outside while we determined the identity of all these bees. You can tell them apart looking at things like whether the hairs split on their backs and stuff like that. They can tell each other apart easily, but this is tricky business. So yeah, that study took a while to do, a couple of years. It takes 9 months even for the coffee to mature after being fertilized. So with similar undertakings, we then went to look at pest control. So here, this was all led by Taylor Ricketts, who's a professor at Vermont now. And then a student of mine named Danny Karp decided to tackle this problem of pest control. So there's this terrible pest on coffee, the coffee berry borer, this little tiny 3 millimeter long beetle that bores in and sets up shop and eats up the bean that we would otherwise be enjoying. And so to run a pest control experiment, you go out all over the countryside setting up these exclosures that prevent say, in our case, we were looking at birds and bats. And how effective are they at preventing the pests from devouring the crop? And so you can see up there in the upper left, we had some, they're all at different distances from forest, so these are all close to that patch of forest. In some, we let the birds in, but not the bats in. In others, we let bats in to feed on whatever they could, but not the birds. In others, we excluded both, and finally, we had a control that let both types of organism in. And this meant having a bunch of people zooming around the countryside in the dark, early in the morning, to raise, and then in the evening, raise and lower these nets appropriately so that the right treatment is going on for months at a time, and then comparing yield and degree of infestation. So another major undertaking. And we found in the end that birds contributed to reducing infestation if you were near forest by about 50%, which also translated differently on different farms, but into a massive economic boost. By contrast, we found that bats were really complicated. Sometimes they ate up the berry borer, other times they were eating other things. And it just is a reminder of all the mystery in life and how blunt our approaches are right now to trying to value it. And a reminder of how humble we need to be and thinking about the many intimate connections between people and nature. But that study involved, about 250 bird species and about 70 bat species that live in around these coffee farms. So there have been tons of these studies. And the question now, over the past decade or so, is, how do you go from studies like this to policy and finance? How do you really make a difference? Before I answer or try to answer that question, I'm going to dive into another realm of research just to give you another taste of what's going on in this broad agenda. And that is to think about where we live today and how we've basically entered the urban century, and humanity is becoming more and more an urban species. So taking away from the beauty of the tropics and out in the farming countryside, and now thinking about the world's massive cities that more and more of us live in, and about the mental health issues. There are a lot of issues living in cities, and one that's not gotten very much attention and yet is more and more on the radar is mental health. So city living, is involved with it, or associated with a 20% increase in anxiety-related disorders, a 40% increase in mood, mostly depressive-related disorders compared to people living in countryside situations. And this made headlines a few years ago with a paper that came out in Nature by a German group in Mannheim, Heidelberg, looking at how, different the behavior of the mind in responding to stress is among people who either grew up in different situations in more countryside versus huge cities, looking at the amygdala that really gets set back in the early ages of child development, or you can also tell kind of where people live today with parts of the brain that remain plastic as we go through life and adjust to different surroundings. So a student of mine working together with a bunch of people in psychology, I'm just going to give you a taste of one of many experiments underway, decided to look at this. I was afraid he was going to be with me. I liked him a lot, but for 100 years, because it seemed so complicated to work out the impact of, say, nature experience on mental health. But he decided, if you've been to Stanford, to get people to come into the psychology department, take a bunch of tests. So here's sort of the protocol. Take some tests. They're all urban people. They've all arrived in kind of a bit of a panic under stress because there's never any parking. And it's hard to find the building. Then they had to go into this lab, take these tests. Everybody was equally stressed out at the beginning. And then they were randomly assigned to take this shuttle bus and drive 10 minutes or like 8 minutes, either to El Camino, if you guys know the place, and take a 50-minute walk, 50-minute walk along El Camino. It's not a terrible street, when you think about the world's massive cities, but it's a big urban street. Or take this nicer walk 8 minutes away in the other direction around kind of under some oak trees and stuff. And it was incredible to see what a difference came of the two groups. So there were different tests. There are many tests, as you guys know, developed in psychology and, played with for many decades now. So they're well understood. So here's one type of test, just answering these little math questions. You've got to answer them quickly, get them right, and then memorize the number that's flashed at you between the math problems. So true or false? Letter. Remember that letter. True or false? Remember the letter. True or false? Got to wake up. Remember the letter. True or false? Remember the letter. And this can go on and on. And the question was, okay, would the groups be different? They're basically the same at the beginning, no statistical difference and look after. This is the difference in the number of letters remembered after they've taken the walk as compared to before. And you see, at least we didn't make life way worse for the urban people. They did a lousy job before, and they still did a lousy job after their walk. But the nature people went popping up and could remember about 11 more letters than those who had that urban walk. So it's just pretty eye-opening things like this. Another type of test involved just asking people how they felt. And it's in the realm of rumination, something we all do, this sort of repetitive negative thoughts about oneself, like saying, dang it, why did I, kicking yourself, for making some silly decision or doing something you regret months, even years later. And that's what you look like when you're doing it. And here too, people came in, everybody the same at the beginning, but after the walk, the people that walked in nature, when asking to respond to these types of questions and say how they felt, I spend a great deal of time thinking back over my embarrassing or disappointing moments. The nature walkers just kind of let go of it all. The urban walkers were still ruminating, at least a pretty dramatic difference there. And a final type of test that we engaged in involved brain scanning before and after the walk to look at which parts of the brain really get activated. And interestingly, relating this to rumination and to the risk of onset of depression, there's one part of the brain in particular, the subgenual prefrontal cortex, that gets activated. Its activation is a risk factor, basically, in depression. And what we found was that, again, luckily we didn't hurt anybody walking on that El Camino, but the nature people had a much lower level of activation of that part of the brain after just a 50-minute walk. So all of this taken together, there were many other tests done, showed as a result of, it seemed, of nature experience, an increase in working memory and in mood and improvement, a reduction of anxiety and tendency to ruminate. And there have been a lot of studies, not thousands really as in the other case, but maybe hundreds over the past decade. We have a new article coming out actually soon. If you happen to be interested, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy, hopefully soon, of the proof. Kind of reviewing this and showing how we would make a model that actually allowed you to predict the impacts of some aspects, some types of nature experience, as complex as they are, on cognitive functioning and emotional well-being, a big subject among educators today when you look at how many schools are situated in places with basically no green space around them, and how many workplaces as well. So how do you go, though, from these initial studies to making a meaningful impact? And that's what I want to dive into now. And this is where everybody's more than welcome to jump in. So the idea in systematizing a universal approach is to start developing a common language and basically a suite of models that are based on evidence, obviously, on good science. And in many realms, we have enough evidence. I'd say this is just an emerging realm, and it's sort of in a light gray color. But in many realms, we know a lot about the role of elements of nature, whether it's wetlands or big forests or just small individual trees and things, contributing to coastal protection, to cooling cities that otherwise heat up something, like 7 degrees Celsius more than surrounding areas in cities, or to food production via pollination, pest control, and other benefits, flood control provided by wetlands, upland forests, and so on. So there are many, many benefits where we can account for the role of nature in helping to deliver or secure the supply. And we're developing models of all of these and integrating them into an open source, free sort of data and modeling software platform. And this has now, we've been developing it for about 7 years or so, And the models have been taken up to some degree in most countries. So people, at least grad students, are playing around with them in a lot of countries. And at the other extreme, in some places, they're being used to drive massive changes in policy and finance. And that's what I'll showcase now. And we could then be thinking together about how to improve the science and bolster all this side of it, but also how we can really mainstream and scale up the efforts that we see underway. So we've been working as a partnership all over the world, and we have two main kind of decision contexts. One is in development planning by governments, by development banks that invest, hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars in infrastructure and other development plans. A new area for us is in sustainable, livable cities and developing the software. We have about 8 models now in sort of a beta testing phase, accounting for the role of nature in cities. And then these kind of underpin it all. Coastal climate resilience, whether in cities or across countries, securing fresh water, like New York City did, and then we're working a bit in the private sector, not so much, and we can talk about why later. We're just getting way less traction there than with more public-oriented institutions. I'm going to give you examples from Latin America and China. So in Latin America, the example I'll give involves basically replicating what happened in New York and cities waking up to scarcity, as we saw in Sao Paulo or in Cape Town recently, and actually in many less talked about but equally severe crises with the growth of cities and with climate impacts and with just inadequate infrastructure. Water security is just a dramatic problem in many, many places. And water often comes from kind of a world apart from urban residents and other downstream users. So here in the Andes, a Quechua-speaking person, hundreds of kilometers away from industry, from urban residents, from big agricultural businesses and cooperatives or hydropower producers downstream. And yet they're intimately connected. And how can we, through institutional change, drive investments that yield that win-win-win type of situation that we want, the green growth type of pathway. So the software that we've developed is oriented around addressing the questions that water utilities or other water users downstream would have, such as, well, which activities should we invest in up in these faraway watersheds to achieve greater water security? Should it be, protecting forest like here, or replanting forest in areas that have been deforested, or just fencing livestock away from open streams and rivers would have a major benefit. Where do you do what? And then, given how vast these watersheds are, you can imagine across the whole spine of the Andes and feeding cities down in the valley areas below. Where do you make your investment, and how do you inform your decisions so you're being at least slightly strategic? So the software will identify with a simple digital elevation model, the watersheds, let you delimit watersheds. And these are all these watersheds feeding cities in the Cauca Valley of Colombia, where a lot of the innovation first occurred, bringing the New York model to South America. And let's just take this city up here. Now, here's that city, and here's its watershed on the side. This is the uplands. And you can see the software lets you, it's just a simple set of models letting you determine what portfolio of investments would achieve a given improvement in water quality. So protecting forest up at the top near the ridgeline right up here, reforesting in some key places that have been badly deforested and where there's a lot of potential runoff from farms, adding forests to some pastures, fencing, and adding a lot of understory vegetation, enriching areas where there's a lot of livestock near open waterways. So you map out a lot of social and other data layers, the cost of land and land transitions and things like that, and get your portfolio of investments that tell you then what improvement in water quality you might expect under different budget levels, different interventions on the part of the water utility, say. And so these actually have sprung up now in more than 40 cities, including most of the capital cities in Latin America. And at one level, it's very exciting and promising to see that in a matter of 10 years, there's been widespread uptake. At another level, they seem to sort of be stalling out. There were just 15 more added in Colombia, so I don't know. It's hard to say if we're just on the, which part of the curve we're on here, but there is a worry for anybody in political science or governance or other dimensions that, you know, the initial wave has kind of crested, and how can we keep spreading this? What are the barriers, and how can we lift them to advancing this approach elsewhere? But so far, the monitoring shows a real payoff, even though you expect some of the impacts to take years to manifest themselves. Monitoring so far shows a payoff on both the social and the biophysical goals. So that's what's happening there. It's all spreading into Africa a bit, where we're working in Kenya, around Nairobi, and across parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, and certainly in China. And now I'll turn to China and give you the last and perhaps most interesting case in many dimensions. So everybody's aware, I'm sure, of the environmental devastation in China. Looking back over the last century, in particular, with the incredibly rapid, you know, just historic economic growth and alleviation of poverty, has come just extreme levels of crisis in terms of flooding, air and water quality, and loss of biodiversity, decline even of the most, you know, iconic species like the panda. And the president now, Xi Jinping, is advancing a vision of developing an ecological civilization for the 21st century. And his slogan gets translated different ways, but clear waters and lush mountains are gold and silver. We will not trade them for gold or silver is one of the ways of putting this vision out. And, you know, how could China possibly turn around? You might be wondering and skeptical of advances really being made toward this dream. But it's incredible to see how pragmatic and how determined the leaders are in making this change for many national security reasons, as well as kind of less maybe critical types of reasons. But asking very specifically, well, okay, how much, you know, where and how much should we protect? Tell us and we'll go at it. How can we secure nature and human livelihoods at the same time? You know, what are the options in different areas, particularly ecologically sensitive regions of the country? And finally, how can we move beyond performance metrics like gross domestic product to inform whether policies are really helping us or actually just hiding all the damages like GDP does? So getting into this a little bit, China's gone further than any other country in setting up a system of natural capital accounts and developing with data that get better and better almost month by month, showing exactly where all types of food are produced. And China produces, I think, more types of food, especially vegetables, than any other place. Showing, you know, exactly where the carbon is sequestered, or exactly which ecosystems are crucial for reducing sand and dust storm risk, or also crucial for, you know, augmenting that risk if they're not well managed, mostly arid areas where there's production of cashmere and other, you know, goat grazing and things like that. This is 10 to the 12th tons. There we're looking at, I don't know why I have per capita. It's the, For some reason, we've weighted it by the number of people involved there, and I don't remember why here exactly, and I think I might have swapped in the graphs will look the same either way. What we wanted to note was how important these different services are, and we were not asked to monetize the production of this service, but instead to indicate how many people are affected by sand and dust storms and how many people could benefit from investing in improved grazing and other land management practices in the areas where the sand and dust originate, and that's where the weighting by population came in, and thanks for raising that. It doesn't, it's not a factor as I'm presenting it right here, but it comes into the valuation when you then ask, where should we invest? This, here again, I think it's, yeah, that's the answer. So I'm sorry, I don't have the raw number of the potential export from the source areas. Here it's multiplied by the number of people downwind in the northeastern cities that experience the pollution, air pollution that results. So I'm happy to show you this. The paper came out in Science in 2016, and we could get into it in depth, and I just have a little mistake here in showing the per capita part. But the idea, same thing here, is with water supply for hydropower and irrigation and supply to cities, which parts of the country are most vital for holding the water. And then finally on the biodiversity front, we've mapped out where biodiversity is located and where new reserves will be going in as the government commits to a major improvement in their biodiversity conservation efforts. So what we found in developing these accounts, first off, is that over a 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, most of the services improved in supply, and that was thanks to major investments through the sloping land conversion program made in restoring ecosystems. And it has led to zoning the country around these different benefits, targeting places where the payoff of an investment would be highest, helping the greatest number of people at sort of the lowest cost. So initially it was zoned at this level. We developed a bunch of demonstrations showing how, for example, Beijing gets over half of its water supply from just north of the city, in the Miyun watershed area, how improved agricultural practices in that area would help increase both the quantity and the quality of water going to the city. Another major demonstration using these approaches concerning the south to north water transfer project, this massive transfer of water that's happening from 3 places. This is the Middle Fork, got going a few years ago, and improving water supply down here in the south of Shanxi province. What kinds of investments in improving ecosystems would even make this massive project that has a lot of objections to it feasible and sustainable? And then finally, just the past month, we've published a report on transforming agriculture in this demonstration area, tropical area, that's been heavily deforested, Hainan Island, mostly for rubber production and other crops. How to improve agricultural practices to secure ecosystem services as well as production of the commodity. And I'd be happy to share any of this. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but the idea in this case, this is a one-time sort of thing with 3 source areas, but in this case, the policy is going to extend across the country of investing in transforming agricultural practices, and same with this watershed investment. And so as a result of all this, now the country has zoned about 49% of the land for improving ecosystems, their condition, and supply of services. So in any region, every square meter is assigned a certain land category. There are 4 categories. One's agricultural, one's sort of urban or town, one's sort of industrial, and then there's this natural capital category. And they're all mapped out precisely. And about 200 million people are now being paid to restore ecosystems in those areas that are mapped out for natural capital. And we do also a lot of work to see whether the social goals are being met, interviewing people, often elderly, living in Western, more remote parts of China while their kids are working in factories in more urban or industrial places. And getting to the end here, I just will show one more dimension of this, kind of in the financial side, trying to transform to what they're calling a green financial system, where downstream or downwind beneficiaries, mostly in cities and in the wealthy coastal provinces, are paying inland areas and populations to change their livelihoods, ideally improving both. Working in these key cities, China's sort of top cities, and Lishui being the place where Xi Jinping makes his main announcements over these environmental policies. And finally, a major guide in all of this is something where we'd love to team up. It's a recent development called for in 2014, a new metric, gross ecosystem product. And the idea is to quantify, just like we do for the economy in calculating gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced by ecosystems. So here, if we think about GDP and then consider GEP, they're kind of parallel systems of accounts where you have sort of your capital stock and the suite of goods and services that comes from it. Similarly, in ecosystems, less well known, some overlap that we can account for, and really trying to demonstrate the utility of a metric like this in China. And then there are many development banks actually that want to use something similar in guiding investments in country development. So it involves collecting data from all over, much of it remotely sensed from satellites and things. Also in China, there's about 140,000 ground truthing sites. So there's a very systematic approach to checking what's happening and changing on the ground, analyzing the data, and then running the invest models or new models as we keep building that up to estimate the production and value of services, goods and services that come from ecosystems. And then using this information in 3 contexts. One is just to recognize explicitly the contribution of ecosystems to the economy and society in a way that's ignored in most places when we think about our finance and policy. Second, to guide financial compensation among regions, such as in the water security for cities arena, but in many others, and thinking about hydropower production like in Costa Rica, thinking about air pollution of sand and dust, and many other contexts. And then finally, evaluating whether these policies and the people meant to implement them are performing over time and adjusting as we go. So that's a major innovation that's being tested now at different levels in China on a sort of provisional demonstration basis. And would love to sort of talk if anybody wants to follow up later on this. Top people from government, the guy heading up the National Development and Reform Commission, Department of Development Planning, a major part of the government, and this guy heading up basically the equivalent of the finance ministry, coming to work out how to develop this sort of system of green finance, and very open to input from experts worldwide. And then coming to the very end here, I just want to mention, I'm sure everybody's read and possibly knows a ton about the Belt and Road Initiative, China's investments across the world in many other countries. They're also investing in trying to help universalize this type of approach among receiving countries that now number way over 100, I think, in Latin America and certainly across the ancient Silk Road and possibly maritime Silk Road. So we've been running these trainings. This was our first, and we have a second one planned that have filled up overnight with literally a sort of 48-hour registration period when we get to the maximum we can possibly handle. But just bring this up to spark comments or suggestions on how to accelerate when we get back to Henry Kendall and his reflections on how summers are becoming like a long weekend and how we've got to slow and reverse the rate of planetary destruction. And, however imperfect some of these elements of science and understanding are today, we've got to act a lot more quickly than we are at present. How do we accelerate across the world? So there are a lot of development banks adopting these approaches at one level or another. And yeah, the bottom line is we don't have much time. We have a lot of inspiration to look to, though, and a lot of eager, open-minded, and ready to run leaders in scaling institutions with whom we could engage. So I'm excited about engaging a lot further with them and with you at any level. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to following up.
Glad to answer questions or to give comments on things that maybe she didn't cover, although she covered many fascinating areas of valuing natural ecosystems.
Thank you. So there are a couple of microphones. Obviously, feel free to go if you need to go, and if you want to be brave and be the first to make a little comment or pose a question, please just raise your hand. Dan.
This was very educational for me.
I think it's working.
Yeah. And it's impressive because of its global scope. But naturally, like most people, I try to think locally. Could you comment at all about the possibilities of implementing this approach in this country? Okay,
yeah, that's a harder one. And I've been working mostly overseas to keep my spirit up. But I'm at one level, it's devastating to see how quickly the forests are dying back in California. There's been a lot of remote sensing looking at likelihood of die-off in the Sierra Nevada, where most of our forest is concentrated, and it's extremely high, and a lot of that area seems likely to go up in flames. Part of the reason, I'm giving you this one example to show how innovative, though, some of the solutions are that are coming online. Part of the reason for that, as everyone here probably knows, is this fire suppression over 200 or more years for various reasons. And the question now is, how could we possibly kind of restore what might have been a more natural and certainly much less likely to burn condition to the forests? If you look at photographs from 100, 150 years ago, the forest is way thinner than it is today. And so what's happening, there's this really interesting public-private investment vehicle that's developing called a Forest Resilience Bond, being developed by some people from Berkeley's business school, and together with a lot of scientists in the Bay Area at Stanford and elsewhere, that involves quantifying fire risk and identifying those areas that are most prone. This was written up actually a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. One of my grad students is doing the quantification of fire risk using some interesting remote sensing and AI. And then targeting, the investors are initially a bunch of foundations, kind of public and private foundations, but also the California's major pension fund and counties themselves that are seeing their own life at stake, investing in management to reduce fire risk as quickly as possible and basically cut down a lot of trees, but in a way that will maintain all the other benefits that we want to have from forest. So it's an example of an approach that's coming online. There's also a lot happening on the coastal climate resilience front around the US with the Restore Act following the BP, big oil spill from a few years back. Huge investment in restoration of coastal systems that help maintain resilience to sea level rise and storm surges. So there are some things going on, obviously, but not at scale. And until we get, a price on carbon and actual, improvement in policies as opposed to taking them all apart, it's going to be really hard in this country. And we don't have much legitimacy on the international stage when it comes to enforcing what we have in the way of the Paris Climate Agreement and other, like this week, all these negotiations are going on concerning pollutants of different sorts around the world, and this whole new effort called the Intergovernmental Panel, basically, of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services just launched today. You might have seen in the news an analog of the IPCC for climate. So a lot is happening globally, and I'm hoping that the US will be able to deliver sometime soon.
Do you see any evidence of these concepts taking root in the thinking of actual policymakers and actually being employed in the analysis used by our policymaking institutions?
Yeah, so there are many countries actually that are taking up these approaches. The fact that China has taken them up and that Latin America, led in part by Costa Rica and in part much more broadly by the Inter-American Development Bank, has helped legitimize the approaches in quite contrasting cultural and political contexts. So there's a lot of capacity being built among the governments in developing these natural capital accounts and developing the technical ability to project change in service provision under different scenarios of development. So the banks, with their public mission, are starting to take this up. We're developing a natural capital index for the World Bank. We were just invited to do that earlier this year in 2019, so we're not very far along yet and would love to interact more. We're going to form kind of international working groups on the different metrics like that and approaches so that we further socialize and legitimize and improve them over time. It took a long time in the case of GDP, for example, to settle on how to run the accounting and use GDP in policy and such. So there is a lot going on and a lot of potential to scale up, I think, very rapidly. And much of the expertise is coming from the US, so there is a major role to play here in this country, even as we're limited politically in what applications we can make, although it's not at all political at many levels. This is obviously about basic survival.
Thanks. So one of the things I really thought was interesting about the INVEST framework was how it allowed policymakers to really compare across different decisions that they could make across different sectors and then compare them sort of on a consistent valuation base. My question was looking at the sort of physical and technological interactions that those sectors might have and how that's treated in your underlying modeling. For example, if you had an intervention that was in the farming area, how might that be taken into account if it affected another sector like air pollution, for example? And how would you think about that in your modeling approach?
You've asked a really good question. We set out to make the models modular so that we could not be thinking about the complexity of all those interactions, given how complex each kind of subfield is unto itself. But the aim is to integrate ever more, and we are beginning to integrate in some arenas, such as in likely impacts on trade resulting from major shifts in agricultural practices and level of production and things like that. But I'd say for the most part, the models are still not very connected. And that, in a way, is an asset given the state of the science and knowledge of the more complex interactions. But it also is a shortcoming when thinking too far into the future about the implications of alternative policy choices. So right now, the policy choices tend to be framed around a 20-year time horizon, with the development banks, for example, looking at how a country invests in whether new dams or road and other transportation infrastructure, or a mine, or in expanding a port or urban corridors, things like that. And I'd say as a first cut, the models are much better than nothing, but we all hope to improve these models in multiple dimensions and welcome any kind of collaboration in doing so.
We have a question way in the back now.
Great.
Hi. I was curious. I appreciated your presentation on I appreciate your entire presentation, but was wondering about the metric, the environmental metric that you had to complement GDP. As policymakers are thinking about this, I was curious to what extent this overlaps with some of the. I guess I know Bhutan is leading this,
Yeah.
but you know, and other countries seem to be thinking about it with the whole idea of well-being being at the center. I think it's the gross national happiness that they refer to, and I was wondering if that sort of approach to, and as I understand what they talk about is somewhat similar to the idea of that you're talking about of that being a complement to GDP, and the focus of development should be on the well-being of people, or in what you're describing, the well-being of the environment. And I was curious if you see those two as being completely overlapping. Are they sort of somewhat overlapping, like a Venn diagram? Are they like the focus on the environment and the focus on the well-being of people from a policymaker standpoint?
You've raised a really good question. They're basically, people have been wanting to green GDP for a long time, and there have been tons of sustainability related metrics proposed over the past, maybe 30 or more years. And the one GNH, gross national happiness, from Bhutan got a lot of attention. There are a bunch of others that are important to note. There's so many, in fact, we're doing a review of all of them right now, that, and some are quite overlapping in relying on a system of accounting for the natural capital stock. And this is really, and then others are quite removed and take different sorts of approaches. None of them has really been applied and demonstrated at scale. So the unique thing in the case of gross ecosystem product being developed and applied in China is that it is already influencing the investment of basically billions of dollars, and likely to be, so far its use has been deemed a success. There are definitely worries about its behavior over time, especially when the management in a given province or county can't, control exactly how ecosystems evolve through time and deliver benefits, given that they're such global or otherwise distant factors driving ecosystem change in any given part of the planet. So there are a lot of things, I think, still to work out on this new system being developed, but as everybody here well knows, the mass of data available is really helpful in tracking ecosystem change. And China is setting up basically a remote sensing sort of data repository for, so far, this was written up in Nature about a year ago, if you want to look it up, or I could help you find it, for all Belt and Road Initiative countries to help provide a basis for building capacity to determine, which parts of these recipient countries of Chinese investment are most crucial to protect. So anyway, this data platform is coming online. The use of AI and other analytics is really accelerating, and we've never had as clear a way of tracking ecosystem condition and change as we have today. And that might also help stimulate use. But in the case of GEP, the information coming out fits right into policy in China. In the case of Costa Rica, it's similar. We're working with a central bank, and the metrics are designed out of the same system of accounts to fit right into policy decisions. And then finally, with like the Inter-American Development Bank, the same idea, and with the World Bank on the Natural Capital Index. The idea is to make sure these things get used. So the design involves the users from the very beginning, and that might help assure some impact. Whereas in the past, some of these things like gross national happiness haven't really been used or have been abandoned.
Okay, I think at this stage, Gretchen,
I'm happy to wait down here and say hi to anyone.
We're going to move to a reception
Oh.
on the 9th floor of the Green Building. That's the big tall building. Everyone is welcome. And Gretchen will be there and can continue conversations. I realize there's a lot of questions still to come, but maybe those can be made person to person or small group.
Okay, fantastic.
Overall.
Well, thank you very much for your kind attention.